All right, this is Restoration Ecology Exam 1. So starting off with Module 1, what is restoration ecology? It's the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. This can range anything from small-scale projects to large entire ecosystems, and can sometimes include experiments. So why do we need it? We have lost over 50% of old-growth forest, wetlands, and riparian habitats in the United States, and this has led to losing a lot of ecosystem services. This field was started in the 1980s with the Society for Ecological Restoration by the landscape architect. It was the result of the Clean Water Act. So generally, why wouldn't we restore? We usually wouldn't restore if there were insufficient funds or resources available because it is very resource intensive. So there are three main types of restorations. There's complete, which includes restoring all attributes of a historical natural community. There's ecological services, which is mainly restoring ecological services provided by the environment. And experiential, which is mainly created to provide pleasure for people. So this would be like parks, and it would be done on areas that are so degraded that it would be almost impossible to restore them to any historical landscape. So a novel community is a group of species that have no counterpart in nature. So basically species that usually wouldn't be found together. And it's usually found in areas that have been heavily altered by humans, such as old industrial sites, mine tailing deposits, and abandoned urban areas. Elements of a restoration plan include the project goal, which is like creating a use policy, background info, which is site inventory and analysis, a plan for how to get there, which is goals that describe a site for measurable objectives, an implementation plan. And then there's also post-restoration monitoring and management, which is kind of determining, will you do continued intervention? If so, who's in charge? So how do we determine success of a restoration? We mainly look at diversity in community structure, presence of indigenous species, presence of functional groups needed for long-term stability, capacity of the environment to sustain reproducing populations, normal functioning, integration with the landscape, elimination of threats, resilience to natural disturbances, and self-sustainability. So will it be able to heal itself after a large disturbance? Common challenges that face restorations are changing systems. It's never going to be the same. Everything's always changing around. Limited information. There's a lot that we don't know about different ecosystems interplay. A lack of record keeping from previous restorations and historical sites. A lot of legislative loopholes. Every site is unique in its history. It's not always going to go through the same stages in the exact same way. And conflict among users. Some people may want to use it for hunting. Some people may want to use it for bird watching, and funding and time, which we talked about earlier. Some opportunities that you get with restorations are enlarging preserves, creating habitat links, restoring revenants, restoring ecosystems, education and knowledge gain for both people who are completing the restorations and for the community around it, and increasing community capacity, so building relationships within the community. An example of a landscape scale restoration would be the bog restoration at Kinsey Lake in Germany. It is done by the University of Munich. The goal of this case study was a permanent rewetting and return to a bog ecosystem. The problem was that it was previously drained and deforested, and the main techniques to return it are to recontour the basin floor, create dams to control water flow, and establish pioneers. Small-scale restoration would be Chicago Forest in Chicago, Illinois. This was done in collaboration with Forest Preserve District, Chicago Wilderness, and Paul Gobster. There was a restoration going on in this site, and there was a lot of outcry and protest from the community around it because there was fires and cutting down trees, and that really caught a lot of people off guard. And so they ended up having to stop the restoration there. And so the goal of this community restoration really was to help the community feel more involved and understand why different practices were being used at the site. And they did this by understanding the perspectives of the community so that their concerns could be addressed properly. A restoration with an experiment would be the white sweet clover in Arboretum, Wisconsin. This was done by Dr. Virginia Klein. The goal is to develop a management plan for white sweet clover, which was an invasive species that was introduced to the Northwest in the 1930s. And they did this by doing a trial with 7 combinations of growing season mowing, dormant season and growing season burns, and dormant intervals with no burning. And they found that dormant season burns in the first year and growing season burns in the second year was most successful in combating the white sweet clover. Restoration with volunteers is Presidio in San Francisco. It was done in conjunction with Golden Gate National Park Stewardship Program and volunteer groups. The goal is to protect and restore ecologically sensitive areas, support endangered species, and bring people together. This area was previously developed as it was a former military base, and they did this through native plant nurseries, landscape maintenance, historic site restoration, terrain maintenance / restoration, beach cleanup, mapping pest species, and creating a baseline inventory of the species there. On to Module 2. Ecological community is a community or a group of interacting species living together in the same place at the same time. And they organize themselves based on variation in space, environmental tolerance, ability to reach site, and species interactions. Community dynamics is how communities change over time, and this can be driven by time as all things change with time and different organisms. So disturbance cycles are really important for community dynamics in that they determine how far an ecosystem can progress. So the intermediate disturbance hypothesis states that local species diversity is maximized when disturbance is neither too frequent nor too infrequent. It's kind of the Goldilocks. Um, and it's really important to have regular disturbance to hold an ecosystem in a specific successional state. An example of a keystone species that we didn't talk about in class is the grizzly bear. It restores nutrients to soil and its ecosystem by discarding salmon carcasses, and it provides a large amount of nitrogen and other nutrients to the soil that have been lost over the years. Old, worn out soil in those areas. An ecosystem is the culmination of all living and abiotic organisms in an area together with the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and other interactions. Energy flows through a system by starting as sunlight. It moves through all of the trophic levels from producers, consumers, and energy is lost through the trophic levels as heat and ultimately leaves the upper trophic levels as the form of heat. Some species retain energy in their biomass for a long time. And then there are energetic limits on the number of possible levels, trophic levels that are in the system because it's lost through each level and only so much can get so high. So a biogeochemical cycle describes the reciprocal transfers of chemicals or nutrients between ecosystem compartments. An example of this would be the hydrosphere or the water cycle. This image just basically shows how water moves from oceans or lakes and then gets evaporated, condenses, precipitates as snow, ice, or rain, And then you have runoff and groundwater flow from melts or directly from the rain into streams, springs, fresh water, and then it goes back into the oceans. Patches are small areas distinct in form and composition from the surrounding areas. An ideal patch geometry would be a large round area, as this minimizes the amount of surface area around the edge, um, so that there's enough boundary for species within the site. On to module 3. Um, Reference ecosystems are extremely important to restorations as they define an ecosystem or a landscape. And in every experiment, you need a control group, and these provide something to compare the restored site against. And they also provide motivation that the goal for the restored site is attainable as it does currently exist, so you can make it. It can be very limiting in restorations because they take a lot of resources to evaluate. So you have to plan for the amount of resources to go and look at a reference site. And no two ecosystems are the same. So it can become very difficult to determine what parts of that reference ecosystem you need modeled in the restoration. Project documentation is also a very essential part of restorations, as it'll guide you and others through future restorations. Um, the main ways to document are to take notes, create a work journal, team reports, photographs, and with that, it's very important to have when you took it and where the pictures were taken, um, so that you can compare them over time and know exactly where different aspects of the restoration took place. And receipts are very important for looking at budgeting for future restorations. Research in restoration can be done through observing remnants, and that's like visiting this site. You can do like immersions or samplings, investigating historical communities through written or oral history, looking at physical evidence from the site, such as soil charcoal, tree rings, or pollen, setting up experiments and field trials. So, like testing different amounts of fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides, um, to see which one works best for the restoration. Casey was a very important early naturalist. His work mainly focused on different ecosystems within the Carolinas and Georgia. And his work is often used today to show to serve as a reference for projects that are going on right now as to what sites would look like if Europeans hadn't dominated the ecosystems when they got here and altered them like they have over time. When you're collecting data, it's important to look at physiographic data such as location, climate, soils, topography, and hydrology, biological resources such as vegetation and wildlife, and socioeconomic information for the area such as demographics, regulations, permits, historic land use. Physiographic data is important when planning as it influences possible flora, fauna, local climate, and potential types of disturbance. You can learn about these things a lot just looking at online databases such as NOAA, NRCS, or USGS. So you don't even have to go to the site for a lot of this. Biological and socioeconomic data is important to understand how people and wildlife will interact on this site. It's important to know, help determine how and when different projects will be completed in the restoration. A lot of people are not going to be happy if you're drilling right next to a school or something like that, or a neighborhood. You're not going to be happy with lots of large vehicles like tractors and things like that, as it will create a lot of noise disturbance. Attitudes towards nature are very important, as we saw in the Chicago Forest case study. In wildlife interactions, people may not like if you put grizzlies or wolves on right next to their houses where their cats and small dogs are living, as they could become prey animals. History is very important to understand how the area has changed over time and what state to restore it to, and it also affects site access and infrastructure. On to Module 4. So we saw with the Forest Service a major issue that they had was when they came down to the South and was looking at doing different restoration and management practices in the area, is they really ignored and discredited the poor people in the area who were considered rednecks. They had done prescribed fires in the areas for hundreds of years, and they basically said, "We know better than you because you're some stupid hick." And so it's really important to listen to the locals and pay attention to how they interact with the landscape, and don't assume you know better than anyone else. Just really try to stay humble, because by removing fire, they actually did a lot of damage in the area. Some common human impacts on sites are soil compaction, erosion, off-trail impacts, and cross-boundary effects such as runoff or air pollution. And you can plan for them by setting visitor use policy with stakeholders and establishing infrastructure to minimize potential. Adaptive management is a type of management that changes as new information is revealed or as aspects of the site change over time. It helps fill the gap between scientists and practitioners um, by scientists doing research and sharing their knowledge with practitioners, and then practitioners implementing management strategies into their restoration, and then providing feedback to scientists so that they can continue looking at best practices. Some common ways to engage volunteers are by paying dues, removing trash and pulling weeds, conducting or monitoring small experiments, writing or publishing newsletters or websites, art projects, and building relationships with them. 5 best practices for working with volunteers are communication that speaks to people's minds, outreach that speaks to people's hearts, education that changes people's behavior, matching skills and interests with the jobs that they complete, eating and learning, respecting their opinions, and getting feedback from. Indigenous and local people are very important to restorations, as they provide history of land and how people historically interacted with it. And they can physically help with the restoration and management. And we saw this kind of going back to the Forest Service removing fire from the impacts that that had, because they didn't listen to local people. Federal legislation that commonly is involved in restorations are the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. So in determining where to develop, the 3 steps are avoiding impacts to aquatic resources, minimizing, reducing unavoidable impacts, and offsetting or mitigating those impacts. Sorry. Mitigation bank is a site where resources are restored, enhanced, or preserved for the purpose of providing compensatory mitigation for authorized impacts. 4 options for mitigating are restoration of a previously existing wetland or other aquatic site, enhancement of existing aquatic sites' functions, establishment of a new aquatic site, preservation of an existing aquatic site. When determining how much mitigation needs to be done, you look at the loss type, which is 3 categories based on suite of functions. Priority category, which recognizes the importance of aquatic resources that provide valuable functions. Existing condition, which is the degree of disturbance relative to ability of a site to perform its functions, duration, which is length of time adverse impacts are expected to last, dominant impact, which is manual labor that needs to be done on the site, and cumulative impact, which is incremental impact of action when added to other actions. The two ways for developers to meet mitigation credits are by buying required amount of mitigation credits from mitigation banks in the area, locating nearby area in need of mitigation. When determining mitigation credits, you look at net improvement, which is the net level of functional enhancement to aquatic site associated with proposed mitigation, upland buffer, which helps maintain integrity of adjacent aquatic resources, credit schedule, which is timing and likelihood of successful implementation of proposed plan, temporal loss, which is the time lag between loss of resource function and replacement, the kind, which compares functions or services of impacted resource with functions of services of potential mitigation site, location, which compares the location of impacted resource and potential mitigation site, and they should be within the same ecoregion, drainage basin, and hydrological unit code. Honeycut restoration, I honestly consider it a failure. There was a ton of trash there that no one was cleaning up. Banks were still being entrenched, boardwalks were not created like they said they would be. Invasive and pest species were present, and it's still not draining properly. There are a lot of issues with that site, and there were a lot of things that they said that they were going to do that they ended up not doing. And that is my presentation. So thank